Looking at someone's search history is probably one of the most intimate pieces of information you can get about them. Search content has gotten a really bad rap. There's a lot of rehashed stuff on the internet. We're writing content to serve the reader and not serve Google. What is our right to join this conversation? How can we answer this in a more human way? What are we actually bringing to the table? A totally different need deserves a totally different copy approach. Search intent can be an incredibly powerful customer insight. What is keeping you up at night? What is really top of mind? Like, why is that frustrating? We can do absolutely anything that we can imagine, but we cannot do everything. Why do you trust this instinct so much? I've spoken to 100 customers and I can qualitatively tell you they all want this. Let's face it, Google is stupid smart now. How can we tell this story better?
Tell me a little bit about your content marketing philosophy and the effect that it can have on a business.
Absolutely. Yeah. Content marketing philosophy, when you asked me this, it's a really hard thing to distill down into just a few succinct sentences. And so I feel like I reserve the right to change it in the future. I'm just going to go ahead and say that since the internet's forever. But certainly right now, I am the director of SEO content over at Vimeo. And so I really do focus right now on organic content and how we can build sort of that evergreen library. So I have a lot of thoughts about search and a lot of thoughts about content in general because I've been doing content for a really long time. So you name it, I've probably made it, produced it, hosted it, all those things. Um, one is that I think that search content has gotten a really bad rap. I think there's a lot of terrible, terrible content out there. But that when used correctly, search intent can be an incredibly powerful customer insight. That it really adds a new level to what we already know about our customers, and that when we're writing content to serve that we're actually serving the reader and not serving Google. We're not only serving Google, that we're having the exact same, like Google and we are aligned in trying to serve the reader when we really focus in on search intent, thinking about it as like one of the aspects that makes somebody who they are, things that they search for. I imagine that looking at someone's search history is probably one of the most like intimate pieces of information you could get about them. I can't imagine. And so that's how I feel like that's how I approach that is not necessarily like we need to game the system, but more there are lots of people searching for lots of things and a lot of those don't have great answers on the internet, or they have like really hacked together answers. So how can we answer this in a more human way and hopefully be rewarded over time? So that's one that I feel like search intent is one of the pieces of things that tells you about your audience. It's not the only one. Another one, and I know that this is a pretty common one, and you've probably heard this from your other guests before, but that great content serves the reader. And I think that that kind of trickles down into a lot of different things. I think it trickles down into I don't believe that content needs to be short or long or any one particular thing. I think content needs to be as long as it needs to be to do whatever the reader needs from it, right? So if you think about someone who needs to learn video marketing, everything about it, and like really get up to speed before taking on a new job, they probably need a really lengthy, very in depth, many sections piece of content to really serve as that kind of touchstone for them. When you think about someone who is scrolling through their feed and wants to be inspired, that's obviously a totally different need, right? And so deserves a totally different copy approach, totally different video approach. So I think great content really I feel like we have a lot of debates over things where the answer is actually every SEO's favorite phrase. It depends. Um, so I think that also, I also have a hot take on quantity versus quality because I feel like the answer is why not both? Because I think that when you put out a lot of content, if you're looking at your feedback loop correctly, that kind of teaches you a lot about your reader. That teaches you a lot about what they like, what they don't like. And it's really hard to guess at what's going to hit beforehand if you've not done many rounds of that, many rounds of like putting out lots of articles or posting a lot on social and seeing what people tend to gravitate towards over and over again. Um, a third axiom of my content marketing philosophy is that I think great brands are built over time. And so consistency, even though it's boring, consistency is king, rather than content. Doing not necessarily the same thing over and over again, because I definitely believe in a test and learn approach to content as well as pretty much everything in marketing. But I think for content, one big splashy article or one big splashy campaign or video or whatever it is often what gets a lot of attention because it's sometimes more fun for us to create on our end to do something really out of the box. But if it doesn't line up with kind of a consistent strategy with like something that your audience can over time depend on you for and they know to come to your site, then I think that it's not delivering a lot for you. Um, and then the final one is I'm not sure if it's a content marketing philosophy as much as it's a management philosophy, but it's a little bit of both. My team has heard me say this time and time again, but it's that we can do anything. I really feel like the sky's the limit. Like Envision made a movie, like Drift published a bunch of books. Like we've we've hosted so many like virtual events from scratch where we thought it was going to be a webinar, then we ended up, creating this like multi-day experience. We can do absolutely anything that we can imagine, but we cannot do everything. And so we have to say no to as many or more things than we say yes to.
So there are a few things here, and I'm sitting here taking notes as we're going along.
I wasn't sure if you wanted me to keep going or if you wanted me
No,
to
no, no, no.
just
This is
finish.
good. This is good. Uh, eh, the more the better, right? So there are a few things that kind of stand out to me in what you're talking about. So the first thing we're talking about is search intent and customer insight. I have a lot of my own philosophies on this. More recently, as I've been developing my own thoughts on this a little bit further, is that we can't look at key phrases, right? It's very easy to fall into the trap of looking at key phrases that people might be searching for and thinking of them as check boxes that we need to hit versus actual needs and wants and the why behind this stuff. How are you determining that? How are you thinking about intent and starting to use that to breathe life into the content that's being produced?
Yeah, I appreciate that because I was very intentional about using search intent versus keywords.
Right.
For that exact reason. Yeah, I think there are a lot of keywords that have really mixed intent, right? Like a lot of people search them for different reasons. And so for that reason, it makes them really tricky for us as content marketers. Like we can go after them, but we have to go after them in sometimes a really limited way because we're serving our audience. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's a lot of a guessing game. Like I wish it was a little bit more scientific than I feel like it actually is, but a lot of it is just going through the actual search results, right? A lot of it is looking at what Google is ranking for that. Is it all very similar content? Is it a lot of different kinds of content? Are they serving the answer right on the page, meaning that it's more of a someone needs an answer and then they need to move on with their day? Or is it more links? Is it more videos? Is it more showing that people actually have clicked on these things in the past, and so they are looking to get a little bit deeper into the question? Um, it's looking at the articles and like uh, I am not. I feel like we often get into that skyscraper technique, right? Where we're looking at what there is and we're like, oh, I'll just write it a little bit longer. Um,
Yeah.
I don't think that does anyone any favors, but I do think that looking at an article and seeing what topics they cover and seeing what they've left out is a really helpful technique still. So not necessarily like they wrote 3,000 words, I'll write 3,500 words, but more like,
Right.
yeah, they covered 75% of this process. I think I can get the missing 25% in here.
So we've got the combination of the actual information that's there, and it's really easy using the skyscraper technique. And we hear this a lot on the show now. Um, it's really easy to remix the remix of the remix of the remix because that's essentially what the crux of that is. What are you doing to find those gaps and then address those gaps, even the similar thing, like address the similar things and the gaps in a unique way that even if the byline were taking off of it, it could still be very uniquely Vimeo.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like, we're always sort of asking that question. So, another, like, reserve the right to get better over time at that. But I know we ask the question, like, kind of what is our right to join this conversation, right? Like, that's something that we ask at the outset of an article. Like, what are we actually bringing to the table? um, both as the writer themselves, because obviously everyone on the team has their own, specific set of experiences. They have their own opinions on things that are backed up by what they've lived through or seen or read. Um, what do different people in the company have to bring to the table? Like what opinions do they have or what experiences do they have? But then also, yeah, because we are a fairly well-known brand, we also, I think, do need to consider what do people know our company as? And does that mean that writing about this topic is going to be an exercise in earning trust for something new? Or that writing about this topic is going to be coming from a place of strength and really like making sure that we're staying very true to our brand tenets. So I don't think none of those are necessarily like, no, we don't write about this, right? It's just but it definitely affects the way that we write about it. And then I think the uniquely Vimeo take on that is the fact that I would say writing is not our default format. And so
Right.
looking at any piece of content and asking that question, right? Asking like, how can we tell this story better? And obviously the number one way is like, can we tell it better through video? Um, but also can we like actually in the piece today, there was one or two places where I was like, "Oh, this I could see this as an infographic, and I would have been able to grasp it much more easily if, like, this was visual." Um, and so, like, I think looking for those things, which I know that's a tricky one from an SEO perspective because Google doesn't always reward making things visual. But I think that is one of those places where you use the search intent to decide what to write about, but you use the human behavior to decide how to write about it and assume that, I mean, let's face it, Google is stupid smart now. And
Right.
only gonna get better over time. Um, so you have to assume that they're just gonna get closer and closer. If it's working for the reader, it's going to pay off.
I think I think the thing that stands out to me the most about what you just said here too, and it goes right back at the very beginning of what you said, which is what is our right to join the conversation? Um, do you feel like enough people are actually answering that question or asking themselves that question before they create? And especially in the places where you're actually competing against.
That's a good question. I'd like to say yes, to give everyone like the benefit of the doubt. Um, but yeah, I think that people I mean, it's hard because I don't think that content should be focused on the person that it's writing to and the person that it's writing about, right? Like if you're using I too much throughout it or we or any of that kind of language, like you've taken a hard left turn somewhere and need to go back. Um, but at the same time, yeah, I do think that, there's that sense that you have to be cognizant of who you are and what you're bringing to the table. Um, and just I don't know, just generally adding value. Like I think that that is a conversation that we have a lot about the different content that we put together because there are a lot of things that are interesting, but like what are the things that we can say that no one else can say? And I don't think you can answer that with every single article. I think there are some articles where you will just be, like add into the conversation as best you can. But there are absolutely some things where I'm trying to think of a really good example of brands where it's like they have a specific, I mean, certainly actually in the piece that we're going to in the piece that we're going to edit today, it links to this Think with Google article about the messy middle and about buying behavior. Like if anyone has something interesting to say about buying behavior, it would be Google who changed the way all of us buy.
Mhm.
So I think, yeah, acknowledging that is really important. Yeah, I'm not sure that enough companies do that. I think the ones that are really successful absolutely do. They like have a sense of who they are and where they're coming from. But yeah, there's a lot of rehashed stuff on the internet. And I think that's what we're constantly my team is constantly fighting against, like, as an SEO content team, is like, we don't it's just it's gotten such a bad rap.
Well, and I think that's a lot of where SEO has probably gotten a bad rap over the last few years in particular is that a lot of brands that I've seen, I've worked with, and I've just observed is you get the big old keyword list, and then you're like, okay, we're checking off the keywords and saying we need articles on this, this, and this. And it's like, what right do we even have to enter the conversation? What I want to do is use that as a jumping off point to talk about the planning process that you have. Tell me a little bit about your process and bringing these things together into something a little bit more tangible. How does that work into the content that you're going to create? And how do you use that to also plan long term and short term?
Yeah, so I think, like, planning kind of holistically, great content, what are we going to make? I think you've gotta start, like, if we start from the strategy, personas, who are we speaking to, right? And there's lots and lots of different ways to gather that information. I think the one you should always start with is just actually speaking, like, directly to the people, as many customer interviews as you can do. I think that used to be my favorite. You know, we're not doing a lot of trade shows. I know that some of them are back, but, like, I haven't been to one in a while. But that used to be my favorite element of trade shows, was that it was the best place to meet a lot of the people that I was writing for every day all at once in one go, and to really, really, like, have a good rethink about whether or not what we were creating was hitting that audience and really speaking to them. So yeah, personas, who are we speaking to? Like, both getting qualitative evidence and quantitative evidence. What's that?
I'm going to jump in there for a
Yeah.
second because we actually hear who are we talking to a lot. I actually put together a supercut of who are we talking to.
Oh,
Um, it's something that
do I win
it's
a prize?
absolutely true. Yeah, tell me, can you dig into that just a little bit more for what that process, that interview process looks like for you? Because it's very easy for us to say, who am I talking to and do customer research and qualitative research. Can you dig into that a little bit more? And then we'll kind of take that back out to the strategic level.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'll tell you that it looks totally different for a content team than it does for instance, like a paid media team, right? Which
Mhm.
probably wants to know it from a very, like, check the box kind of way. That sounds negative. I don't mean it as negative, but I mean that, like, they need to know the demographics, right? Like, they need to know, like, okay, like, how old are these people? Like, where do they shop? Those sorts of things. I think from a content team, I'm I'm trying to get inside their head, right? Like, I want to know what they think. And so the types of questions I'm certainly going to start with, like, okay, what is your role at your company? What kinds of things are you doing day to day? But what I'm really trying to find in those interviews is a jumping off point to kind of be like, yeah, like, there was an emotion behind that answer, right? Like, let's dig into that. Like, what is keeping you up at night? I feel like that's, like, a pretty common question for those types of interviews. And it's for a reason, right? Like, what is, like, really top of mind right now? What really, it sounds like that's frustrating. Like, why is that frustrating for you? I actually think that a lot of product teams and product marketing teams do this really well, because they're getting into, like, what makes somebody, click a button or not click a button, or what makes a product actually sticky. And I feel like we need to ask the same questions for our content, right? Like, the user education, especially the user education, but even, I think, even thought leadership, even, like, some of the more media like content that we're creating, it needs to serve a purpose, and it needs to always, like, be correlated with an emotion. So I feel like the nuggets are always in, like, they're never the questions that I wrote down at the beginning of the interview. They're always the follow-up
Right.
questions.
Well, and I think that's a good thing too, because you and I have talked about, and I know I've talked about this with a handful of people now too, is finding that emotional quality that goes into these pieces. And the key phrases are going to tell you what, but the emotional quality in these types of conversations are going to help you understand why people are searching for this stuff. And it's not just a matter of, I think my go to example here is how to do your books, right? Well, how to do your books is something where you could just very easily put on the table, here's how you do your accounting and your bookkeeping and blah, blah, blah. What most people don't think about, or what I've seen not be kind of taken into consideration is that somebody might be searching for this thing because they're scared, because they're going to get audited or their cash flow isn't what it needs to be. And even though you don't need to address those things directly, it is still something that you can think about and have as part of what you're doing when you write or create just in general these pieces. Um,
Yeah. And the
does that ring true for you as well?
It does, and the tone I think is going to be because I could also think of, for that exact same phrase, like maybe an accounting student is researching it, right? And that's gonna be those articles should have such different tones because the accounting student, maybe they're nerding out over it, right? They're like, "Okay, like,
Right.
I know the basics, but, like, how do I do it better? Like, how do I
Right.
really do it the way that everyone should do it?" Yeah, exactly, as opposed to somebody who's like, "I this is a grudge purchase or this is a grudge activity. I don't really want to do it, but I have
Right.
to. And I just need someone to like speak to me like I'm a human and tell me the basics."
How does that idea play into the planning process for you? Like, let's kind of bring it back to that second question there. What does all of this do for the planning broadly, and then down on the individual level?
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, really, that is what, that is the foundation of all of the planning process, right? Is the who are we writing this for? Because out of that comes like, okay, positioning, why should they care? Story pillars, what stories are we telling and retelling, right? Because it's really, even though we're going to write about lots and lots of different topics, there are probably like three or four stories that we're continuing to tell over time, right? And we want to like continue to harp on those over time. Like maybe oh, I'm always bad at thinking of examples right off the top of my head. I'm such a writer in that way that like I need to be like in paper. um, so we'll try to think of one, but if it comes to me later, I'll bring it back up.
No worries. No worries. Story pillars is a really interesting concept, though, overall. And we haven't talked about that a lot on the show. Um, as you're planning out the story pillars and you're seeing these sort of topics emerge, tell me a little bit about your thoughts on story pillars, and then we'll actually break into the pregame process. See how smooth it all ends up going?
It's all so smooth. I love it. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually story pillars are something that I have, I think, incorporated in my planning process by accident in the past. And there's something I'm trying to be a lot more intentional about right now. So it's I'm kind of like forming my ideas on them. But what I like about the idea of story pillars is one, the idea that we don't necessarily need to be reinventing the wheel every time. Like I think that we as marketers probably get bored of the message much more quickly than our audience does. So kind of codifying that and putting it on the board or like writing it down in some way reminds us like we feel strongly that these are the messages that resonate. And usually, we need evidence, right? Like we're going to test them, like we're going to make sure that that's true before we go back to them time and time again. But also, there's usually lots of different ways to say something or to tell something. And so, like, thinking about how we not repurposing content, but we repurpose that story. Like, how do we uh, help someone feel like it is easy to make video through a quick social media post versus a long form article versus a help article versus a video for YouTube or versus a podcast versus any different medium that you can throw at it. Um, and how do we tell them that in different ways, right? Like
Mhm.
it's easy to make videos, and here easy means quickly, right? Or it's easy to make videos, and easy means it doesn't have to be expensive, or easy means you could do it, right? Like I feel like there's lots of different, it's the same story, but you're kind of turning it around and looking at every angle of it.
Yeah, and you're reinforcing that message overall. I think the cool part about story pillars, and this is something that I thought about for a very long time, especially when I was at Shopify, was that the overarching sort of message that everything else falls underneath too. Like if we've got pillars, what is it supporting, right? And for me, the overarching theme of the publication that we had was, what can you do when technology gets out of the way? right? So you have a broad theme, and then you've got this pillars that support what that broader theme is going to be, and then that's the foundation of your communication strategy across all of your mediums. Yeah. So
Love that.
tell me, tell me, thank you. Tell me a little bit more about your pregame. Now we've gone broad. We have pillars. We understand what we're doing. We have an individual piece. It's boiled all the way down to this. Tell
Awesome.
me about your pregame. How have we gotten to the piece in the first place? And then what are you doing before you evaluate that piece? And then we'll break into the piece
All
that
right.
we've got
Awesome. And
today.
I'm gonna call myself out. I told you this in our call yesterday, but just for everyone watching as well, this is dusting off some skills for me a little bit. Since since it's been a while since I've directly edited a piece, so I'm really excited. This is going to be really fun. A lot of times I see things either much earlier in the process, or even just kind of when we're at the strategic level. Um, but yeah, so before we edit the piece, hopefully it lines up with all of those other things that we just talked about, right? So it was put into the editorial calendar for a really specific reason. It already has a specific audience that it lines up to. We probably already have a call to action in mind, like an idea of whether that's directly a button on in the article or whether that's more of like what do we want them to do after this article, right? Like what do we want their next step to be, and they might take whatever next step, like whatever next step they're going to take, but what would sort of be the ideal? So have that in mind. So hopefully like all of that is like set in place and we kind of know like why we've made this piece. And then as far as like just real tactically, like before I sit down to edit a piece, I'm gonna make sure it's quiet. I'm gonna
Okay.
either turn on wordless music or just make sure it's like super silent because I get distracted really easily. Which I think is also probably reflected in how I edit a piece. I like bounce all over the place. So apologies in advance, ADHD brain. I'm gonna get some water. I'm just gonna kind of set up my area because I really need to I need to sit down and focus on it for a solid pretty much until the flow is over. So like
Yeah.
for a solid hour or two. I think in order to really get a grasp. Um but yeah, tactically that's it. It's just sort of like, okay, this is blocked up on my calendar. I'm turning off all my Slack notifications. This is we're gonna really read this piece and figure out how we can make it better.
That's one of my favorite questions to ask because I know when I do my first read throughs, I will always make note of where I disengage, and then like,
Oh
why did
yeah.
I disengage? It's not a matter of because, well, that's the thing too is when you think about it, right? Everybody's got ADHD brain these days. So the idea of making note of when I check out kind of makes me think if this is my job to read this thing,
Right. And I'm
what's it
interested in it, right? Like because I also write about these things. Yeah.
right. Yeah. What I mean, for somebody who's just casual on this, what are they thinking? So cool. All right. So you've done that. You've
Yeah.
tuned everything out.
Oh, and often because A, because I'm a little old school, but B, because I used to commute in and out from an office like lots of people, but via public transit. And so I would do this on the subway is I print it out.
Nice. What's the mindset shift between the two things? Like why?
Why do I print it out?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like so I can't write as quickly and as neatly as I can type. And so it stops me from over editing before I've gotten into the piece. So I feel like
Mm,
this way I can really I can still record my initial reactions, which because I agree, I do the same thing. I like to um note like how something hit me the very first time I read it, where I checked out. Um if like we got to a certain point and I still don't feel like I know what the piece is about, because later on when I do know what the piece is about, I'll forget that, right? So it lets me do that in red pen, but it keeps me from going through and doing things like beginning to move paragraphs around already, or
right.
deleting entire sections, or like correcting the spelling or the grammar.
I think what's neat about that and what it boils down to is you're setting limitations on yourself in the editorial process, right? Your ink has value to it. Erin Balsa was on a few episodes back, and she said that when she edits, a lot of what she'll do her first read through is actually on her phone. And I thought that was brilliant because that's where a lot of people are going to be reading, but it also gives limitation to how she's going to type or edit or make that feedback as well. So I always love that question for that reason. All right, cool. If you can share your screen and the link to the document inside the chat here, we can jump straight into it. So, the working title of this is Seven Scientifically Proven Ways Challenger Brands Can Flip Customer Preferences. What was your first
Yes.
impression of the piece when you read through it?
So my first impression, it's kind of this, that the headline lied. Um, so I loved the concept of, and we'll get into it, but I loved the concept of the messy middle, and there was a lot of really interesting, like there was a lot of science in here, and there was a lot of really interesting how we can use behavioral insights to get at what we should be doing for e-commerce marketing. Um, but I really tried to find where the seven were. I feel like anytime you do a listicle title, I want to see them all listed out. I couldn't find it, which is why I started writing out these new headline ideas. Um, and this is actually why, like, I tend to, when we calendar these out, make these like X and then make sure I go back and fill it out at the end for exactly that reason, because it's really easy to forget. Um, but yeah, that was my very first impression was, oh, this piece isn't what the headline says it's going to be about, but it is interesting, and we can get at that nugget. Um, so yeah,
Betrayal.
betrayal by the headline. Yeah, I think, I feel like I assume that other people feel this way too, that I hate to feel like I was lied to. Um, yeah, that's teasing. Um, so yeah, so then I went through, I read it all the way through. My next piece of feedback was really that I feel like the intro is too long. And I actually think that the intro kind of restarts here. So like this is sort of going after one thing, and then we kind of restarted the intro here. Um, and then I wrote down on my very messy like piece of paper by the end of this intro that by now I need to know what the article is about and why I care. So I just kind of made a mental note that like we kind of need to come back and find some for the intro. I think it's really common. So like I said, I told you I was going to skip around a little bit. Um and I think that it's really common, at least in my pieces and in others that I've edited, that sometimes we put the intro at the end. So I did this and I scanned all the way down to see how the piece ended. Um, and I do think that this is sort of the why you should care, right? This idea that like, okay, by getting into the behavioral science, you can nudge shoppers and you can make your brand come out on top. And so I made a note there too that like, okay, like all of this needs to be kind of shoved up to the intro, and then probably reframed in a way that pulls people in. Because I liked the fact that that what this was trying to do was sort of you know, make people think about the process of buying something and like how crazy not linear it is. But it didn't immediately connect to who they were talking to or why they should care. So that was just something that I made a note of, that like, okay, this intro needs to be rewritten. I think we can definitely keep this idea of like, hey, humans are weird creatures. We buy in lots of different ways. It's not linear, but it needs to be way shorter, and it needs to immediately say like, but there are there is actually some reason, there's some method to the madness, and you can tap into it and it will make your e-commerce brand better.
I'm just writing stuff down here. Um, so you've got the two intros here. That's kind of an interesting thing. Can you highlight for me what you thought those two were again? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, so it's less that they were 2 complete intros, it's more that I felt like this restarted it. So, like, it's starting to go through this line of questioning, and then I felt like this before the internet, you only had to focus your marketing in 2 areas, brand and performance, is a totally different bent than
Mm,
these 2 questions of, "Let's think about your customers. What are they thinking? What are they doing?"
gotcha. Okay, okay.
Do you am I alone in
Yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah. No, I see what you're saying. I totally get it. Cool. Well, digging into it a little bit more, when they are actually getting to the point in this piece, how are you feeling that how it's demonstrating that point or what the core of that piece is about?
I see what you're saying, yeah. So I think the core of the piece is down here, it's in point 3, and I actually think that these I would reorganize, I think this piece needs to be reorganized because so this part right here is actually is actually referencing that image above. Sorry, I'm like I don't wanna go back and forth all over make everyone do what I constantly do. But I will scroll back up to it real quick actually. So it's referencing this image above because if you click through to this uh Think with Google article, this actually has like it has a title and then it kind of goes through and defines each of these. And I think that that summary is what's missing from here as sort of the like, okay, there are a bunch of cognitive biases that influence how we buy. And so then how you can use them is what's down here. Um, the cognitive shortcuts people relate as it takes to shopping. Like I think this is actually like we could almost rework this, and that could be the title of the article. And a lot of what's above it is kind of the stuff you need to understand in order to get to this, right?
Mm,
Because this is, as I understand it, like this is written for e-commerce marketers, and it's written from a company that wants to help them optimize their websites. So this kind of idea of like, okay, Google discovered something really interesting about the way people buy. I think actually that entire like there's a lot of really great research in here. But because of the fact that the core of the article is down here, I actually think that most of this research should either be reorganized underneath this section as like supporting points to each of these ideas. Like, you can use category heuristics um, to put yourself above your competitor brand, um, or to just everything above here basically like make much more concise, right? Like I think it's totally possible to uh, and really interesting when it's a brand like Google, especially, like they're going to put out a lot of things that nobody else has the power to do. To take another article and to basically write a response to it, right? And that's what this kind of is in my mind. Like, there's, a big report came out, and you're like, here's like why it matters for you, e-commerce
mm,
marketer, right? Like, we're repackaging it. And so I feel like when you repackage it, um, what needs to happen is this first part needs to really as quickly as possible synthesize the key parts, not the entire like I think there's some parts that probably could be thrown out because really what they're trying to get down to is you can use these 6 cognitive biases to get people to buy more from you and not your competitors. And then this section after kind of adds speed to the list, which I think is probably where these 7 the title came from. And so I think maybe, like, that could even maybe be reworked if it was something like the 7 let's see. I think the the reason I'm split on that one is that I'm not sure it's 100% clear that speed is a cognitive bias in the same way the other 6 are.
mm. Yeah, it's almost like you've got two separate pieces here. Um, like you have to define what the messy middle is, and then you have to break into why speed is important in the messy middle. but how do you define that
Yeah.
and then not shoehorn speed into it?
Actually, I think I just figured it out, and I think it is it if we strip out a lot of the language about a lot of the scientific language, right, about cognitive bias, and I think if we just say like basically 7 weird facts about humans that that make them buy the way they do. That's not a great title, but you know what I mean, something along those
Yeah,
lines. Then we can add speed back in, right? Because then the 7th fact would be something like humans are super impatient. Like the idea that if your site doesn't show up in the time it takes from a popcorn kernel to pop. I really liked this part, like quantifying that, I thought was really good. And I also thought that this overall, and I'll stop moving the page all around so people can read it while they're looking at the screen. Um, this overall, I thought would make a really good infographic. Like you could show the entire, like, here's how much time somebody's spending on your site, and it's like this is their first impression. Like here's this them settling on the area, and then like here's them scanning it, right? And like somewhere in this time period, like this entire thing is taking place in, you know, like less time than it takes you to heat up a cup of coffee. I don't know if
right.
anyone else does that. My coffee gets cold and then I bring it back to the microwave. Um, but you know, something like that I think could be really interesting. Um, but yeah, I think this is a classic example of I when I say that things, like, need to be as long as they need to be, I would probably like everything from here to here, and not everything, but, like, this section, I'm just gonna take a look and see how long it is because 'cause I'm curious. Um, I
800
would
words, 900 words.
I
Wow.
I would probably make that, like, 250 words, right? Like,
Yeah.
just, like, way reduce that down to yeah, down to exactly what you said, like, this kind of description of, like, what the messy middle is and why you should care, and front load the why you should care, and then get into, okay, like, let's unpack, like, these like, okay, we know that humans buy in really weird ways. Let's unpack the different things that we do, and I would rename each of these, right? Like, I wouldn't call this category heuristics or the power of now or any of those things. I would call it, and actually, I'm gonna cheat and look at Google's descriptions of them. Um, but yeah, this idea of like, yeah, like people don't like to wait, right? Or people trust other people, they don't trust you, the company. I think that would be more powerful if we broke all of these down and kind of. It's funny because I know marketers love this idea of like we're decisions backed by science. I feel like those headlines do really well. But because we're marketers and not necessarily scientists, I think it is always helpful to reframe these ideas and to, you know, use the term, but use the term not in the headline, use the term in the body copy when it's like, okay, like this is referred to as category heuristics, but like in layman's terms, it just means that, you know, different short descriptions of key product specifications can simplify buying decisions.
I think this is interesting because, our mutual friend, Ryan McCready, um, he was on the show not too long ago, and he had said that he hates when people open up, anything with somebody else's research because it devalues your own personal knowledge or like your own personal expertise to then lead with somebody else's research. So it's kind of this idea of flipping that on its head a little bit. Um,
Yeah, I don't totally disagree with him on that. Like I watched that episode, I found it really interesting.
yeah.
I think what makes this I agree. I think leading with a stat or leading with someone else's research and not having a point of view on this, I think what would make this different in this article would be the idea that you're tying each of them directly to what they mean to an e-commerce marketer. Um,
Mhm.
I think that that would, and then supporting them with the research, with the stat. But I agree that I think like this needs right now this read a little bit to me as a rehash of the Google article, and I thought
Mhm.
that I felt like it needed to be reorganized around the audience. So reorganized around, okay, like we're trying to, you an e-commerce marketer are trying to get more people to buy from your website. Here's how you can use this research from Google to do that. We're going to unpack it for you.
I like that. I like that a lot better. So here's another question, right? We were talking about before. Let me just get the right focus on the screen here. We were
Yeah.
talking before about. We'll bring
Zoom
that back
in.
up.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. We were talking before about the right format for the job, right? But as a director, you know that the right format might not always be the one that your budget would allow for, right? How
Fair.
do you reconcile those two things? Because we do have a lot of in-house people who watch the show. How are you reconciling those two things? This would make a really great video, but how do we prioritize production of that? What are the soft skills involved there to make it so the end user has what they need?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I would say two things. One is that I rarely, if it's not able to be done with a pretty light lift, I rarely recommend that we go ahead and do things like full force on the very first. Like if this was the first time that we were writing about this topic, um, then we probably wouldn't put together, that infographic or the inline videos or any of those things. We'd, kind of find like a B plus version of that and push it live. And then 3 months later, look and see how it did. And if it does really well, like if it performs on social, if it's picking up some search traction, if it got high click throughs from our email send, like it's kind of giving us some signals that people really like this piece and it's going to be a long term performer for us, then that is that's a good argument for me as a director to be like, hey, this is worth our budget, right? Like there's a built-in
Mhm.
audience here. This is a long-term piece. But again, a lot of that is also because I am right now really heads down creating evergreen content. So I'm testing a lot of
Right.
stuff that way. We're putting out things, and then yeah, if there are positive early signals, then that's where the budget goes. Um, and I think that does kind of feed into the second half of your question, which is really like what are the soft skills, right? Needed for yeah, needed for making the argument to spend some money on these types of pieces. And I think it's hard. It has to be the right piece. Like we probably can't do it for every single piece, as much as
Right.
that pains me to say, because I want them all to live their best content lives. Um, but we probably can't do it for every single piece. We probably can do it for, again, like the high performing ones or um, the ones that we know are really close to the product, or they're just they crystallize our core message. And this has become this is really like a pillar piece, and there's other pieces that are leading back to it. Like I think those are easier to make an argument that like, okay, well, we know that we're going to have a lot of eyes on this, and so we want to devote some more resources to making this really work. And then those kind of help me put together that larger, like, okay, um, I need $5,000 for a graphic designer to come in, or really like, for something like this, we'd probably be looking for like a data visualization expert, right? Like a graphic
Mhm.
designer, but someone really specific. And like, here's why that is going to make this piece sing, like it'll have an evergreen home, but I'd probably want to find some other ways that we were using it too. So like we're going to re-promote this piece on our internal newsletter. And we have proof from other newsletters that this type of content, does better than just linking back. Or if we don't have proof, which is often the case, especially if it's something really new and really cool,
Mhm.
something we've never tried before, a plan in place to test it, right? And some sort of like, we're going to go small this time and like do enough to test the idea to test whether um creating a video for each piece of content will actually make them rank higher or um I think coming into it with a hypothesis is another way to sort of like unlock a small amount of budget now for potentially a larger amount of budget later.
Nice. So the crawl, walk, run approach.
Yes, 100%. Thank you for crystallizing. Thank you for editing. That was better. That's better. Yes, the crow walk on fridge.
No, no, I think it's great. Now, the opposite of that though, right? Because I'm a swing for the fences type, like, hey, we've done the research, I've seen it, this is what we know is going to happen in the market. Like we can tell that nobody's addressing it yet. How are you balancing that crawl, walk, run approach with like
Like,
actually going all in on something even though it's completely crazy and untested?
that's a really good question. I am attracted to the big swing approaches, but I, in all actuality, haven't. I feel like I do tend to test and learn more than I do
Mm,
like let's go all out. I feel like the let's go all out is after we have some early signals from something. So maybe in that case, like maybe the early signals are not necessarily from performance of content, but the early signals are from like I've spoken to 100 customers and,
mhm.
like, I can qualitatively tell you they all want this, right? Like, this is very clearly a good idea. And then, yeah, but I think that then that's what you use to make the budget ask, right? So it's still a big fences swing. Um, but I think you need something behind that to be like, well, why do you trust this instinct so much? And it's like, well, I've got a reason, you know?
Yeah. And then you have to really learn how to communicate that in making your case, which
Yes.
can be very challenging, but
Very challenging and very, I feel like also sometimes like very team by team and executive by executive, right? Like you have to
mhm,
learn like what types of things what types of things different teams, I feel like I've worked for teams where they valued being kind of hacky, right? It's like, yeah, like if you can make something happen really fast and you can prove immediate results, like we'll absolutely unlock huge things for you. And I've worked for other teams where it was more like, we value a really polished final product, right? Like we want you to go through the right systems. We want it to be really best in class right out the gate. Um, and so I think a lot of it is also learning at your particular company, what do they value, and it does this fit.
yeah. Yeah, I love that as an answer there too. We we do have an audience question from Shlomo, and thank you Shlomo for asking.
Cool.
Robin said earlier that she doesn't think about length as a factor in creating content. Does she say the same thing for video content and for video clips to promote it on social?
Interesting. So it's not that I don't think of it as a factor. I think that is it is incorrect to think of like word count as the like that's not what makes the longer content better. What makes the
Mm,
longer content better is that it's more comprehensive or if it's more comprehensive. That's what makes it better. I think the same thing about video content. I think that if there's a really good reason that something needs to be an hour long, then as long as you have like it should still be scannable, right? Like you should have, which I know it sounds silly for a video, but like you can chapter a video, right? Like
mhm,
have chapters on it, like have a description that calls out the different points in the video that you can go to. So I think it's similar, but of course it also depends on the channel. Like that's certainly an SEO specific, like, I know that a common thing that a lot of SEOs believe is that, like, we can just add 500 words to it and that'll make it better.
mm.
And so I feel like that is definitely a channel by channel basis because you're totally and I think this is what you're getting at. You're totally right that, like, yeah, an hour-long video, I mean, it won't even I was about to say it won't play well on TikTok. It won't even fit on TikTok. Obviously. It's not gonna play well on LinkedIn, right? Which even is like, lends itself to longer content. But I think the same thing about video as with articles or really any type of content that also saying there's a certain limit, like, okay, we don't do anything longer than 30 seconds on Facebook ever, um, or we don't do anything shorter than 10 minutes is often limiting. I think constantly testing that because formats change, right? Like it used to be on social media and even on LinkedIn that it was like keep it as short as possible. And now, you see these huge, long sentence by sentence posts getting all of the attention. So I think it changes over time.
Yeah, and it really depends on the format too. So like this, I can use this as an example, this show, right? I personally believe that the best way to consume this is in the live format because it's much easier to sit for an hour, right? Us together and have this conversation together than it would be to watch an hour long replay. Now, people who watch the replay and have got to made it this far, you're probably going to disagree with me. But you have the opportunity to also see what is like your little spike marks in these, if you're watching your analytics on what little sections do well, and then cut those down to size and create content that's a little bit smaller. So you have this bigger ecosystem of things where people are getting what they want, how they want it.
Oh,
Um,
I totally agree with that.
yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
I think for me, like, every time we do one of the clips of the show, it's always informed by and on YouTube, the relative, audience retention graph, because then we can say, "Oh, this got the most attention in this area. Let's see what that was," and then clip it. Cool. Well, we are almost at time here. Robin, can you just sort of sum it all up for us? You put it all in a nice, neat little bow, and then we'll close it out?
The whole edit or
Yeah, just
content strategy, the
the
secret
whole
to life.
thing. Yeah, the secret to life.
Um, I think let's see, for this edit in particular, am I still sharing my screen? No, I'm not.
Oh,
For this edit in particular, I feel like the nugget at the bottom of it is make sure that you're make sure that you're delivering on your promises and that you are packaging whatever message you're trying to send in a way that is really specific to the audience that you're speaking to. How's that?
awesome. I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us live tonight. I very much appreciate it. Robin, you were fantastic. And I look forward to talking with you again on maybe some other projects that I've got in the works. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the night.
Thanks, everyone.